Walter Grady, 66, was a familiar figure in the Brooklyn neighborhood where he had lived without a home for more than 10 years. Gaunt and sun-worn, with a silver beard that hadn't felt proper care in ages, he was rarely seen without his battered military-style backpack, faded green canvas, straps torn and fraying, once standard issue. Residents knew him as the quiet one. Unlike many others in his situation who begged for change or caused scenes, Walter stayed reserved. He gathered bottles to redeem, sometimes took leftovers handed to him by kind-hearted restaurant employees, and rotated where he slept in different entryways so that no single shop owner grew resentful. What almost nobody realized was that Walter had served over 2 decades in the U.S. Army, honorably discharged in 2004. 4 years later, his wife Margaret lost her battle with cancer, a disease the VA hospital had first misdiagnosed. After her death, Walter fell into despair. He refused support from relatives, sold their small apartment, gave the money to the charity his wife most admired, and vanished into the anonymous flow of New York City. Sometimes it's easier to be nobody than someone who couldn't save the one they loved most, he once confided to a soup kitchen volunteer. On a bitter November afternoon, with temperatures sinking below freezing and snow on the way, Walter stepped inside Morelli's Corner Market. He hadn't eaten for 3 days, and his hands shook as he tucked a day-old loaf of bread under his coat while Mr. Morelli helped another shopper. But the owner had recently mounted wide security mirrors. "Hey, stop right there," he yelled, already grabbing the phone. "I'm calling the police." Walter didn't flee. He just stood quietly, the bread still visible in his half-zipped jacket. "I only needed enough strength to get through another day," he murmured. Within minutes, 2 patrolmen arrived. The younger one, Officer Jenkins, seemed uneasy as he cuffed the frail man's thin wrists. "You really a veteran?" Jenkins asked, spotting the chain of dog tags hanging under Walter's shirt. "This ID's almost unreadable." Walter nodded. "I used to be useful, not anymore." Jenkins sighed. "Sorry, sir. Gotta take you in. The store owner's pressing charges, says you've been caught stealing before." At the station, Walter was processed like any other minor offender. A public defender gave him a short meeting, but seemed more interested in closing cases than listening. A court date was set for the next morning, a preliminary hearing where charges would be made formal. When dawn came, Walter was brought into Brooklyn's municipal courtroom, still wearing the same rumpled clothes from the holding cell. No family sat waiting in support. No friends or advocates spoke on his behalf. Just a handful of attorneys, reporters chasing larger cases, and clerks working through routine dockets. Case number 47,293, State versus Walter Grady, the clerk intoned. The young prosecutor rose, tugging at his tie. "Your Honor, the defendant was observed stealing bread from a local grocer. Considering his prior petty thefts and lack of permanent residence, we ask for continued detention until trial." Presiding was Judge Michael Carmichael, stern and known for swift, no-nonsense rulings. He scanned the folder, barely looking at Walter. To the crowd, it was already a dismissed matter, just another homeless man stuck in the system. "Mr. Grady, how do you plead?" Judge Carmichael finally asked, glancing up. "Guilty, Your Honor," Walter said quietly. "I was hungry." Someone in the back chuckled. The judge's glare silenced them. Then his attention dropped again to the papers. "Walter Edward Grady, former Staff Sergeant, United States Army." His voice trailed as he read. The room fell into stillness while his expression shifted. His grip on the bench edge whitened his knuckles. He looked at Walter, then back to the file, then at Walter again. Abruptly, without a word, Judge Carmichael rose to his feet. The courtroom froze in astonishment. Judges rarely stood in simple hearings. For several moments he remained silent, his features restrained yet tense. "Your Honor?" the prosecutor prompted, uncertain how to react to such a break in procedure. "Court will recess for 15 minutes, Carmichael announced, his tone unexpectedly rough. "The defendant will remain." As he departed to chambers, murmurs spread across the gallery. Only Walter stayed still, eyes on the floor, either indifferent or oblivious to the sudden shift his name had caused. What do you think when veterans give their lives to service, yet end up forgotten on the streets? Stay with us to learn what brought that entire courtroom to a standstill. Inside chambers, Judge Michael Carmichael opened his desk drawer and pulled out a worn photograph, a group of soldiers in desert uniforms standing outside a field hospital in Iraq. His hands shook faintly as his eyes locked on the image. He was there, 20 years younger, serving as a medic before pursuing law. And standing tall in the back row was Walter Grady. The judge quickly turned to his computer, accessing a military database he still had clearance for from his work with Veterans Affairs. Walter Grady's military record flashed onto the screen, verifying what the judge had already suspected. Staff Sergeant Walter Grady had completed 3 deployments, 2 in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan, working in logistics, ensuring critical supplies reached forward bases during the most dangerous stages of combat. He had been awarded the Bronze Star for valor after a 2003 ambush on his convoy. Instead of seeking shelter, Walter drove a burning truck away from wounded soldiers, suffering injuries himself, but saving 17 lives. Within the file was a photograph once featured on the front page of the New York Times. Walter carrying a wounded Afghan child toward a medical helicopter during a humanitarian mission. For a short time, that image had represented American compassion in the midst of war, before public attention moved elsewhere. But what truly gripped the judge was a mission report from July 2003, recently declassified. In the middle of a frantic evacuation under enemy fire, Walter had carried an injured medic, Private First Class Michael Carmichael, nearly 2 miles to safety, despite being hit by shrapnel himself. "My God," the judge whispered. It was him. Judge Carmichael had spent years searching for the man who had saved his life, but Walter had vanished into civilian anonymity after leaving the Army. The judge had never known more than a last name, shouted through the chaos of combat. Now the truth stood before him. While the judge absorbed this revelation, Walter sat alone in the courtroom, unnoticed by the bailiff scrolling his phone during recess. For 15 years, Walter had survived at society's edges, unseen by the very institutions he once defended. After Margaret's death, grief consumed him, made worse by untreated PTSD. The VA's misdiagnosis of her cancer had broken his trust in the system completely. When she passed, he abandoned everything, his benefits, his pension, even his identity. He could not face the bureaucracy that had failed the one he cherished most. For years, locals regarded him as an annoyance. Teenagers sometimes hurled food at him for amusement. Shopkeepers sprayed down the sidewalks where he rested. Officers ordered him to move whenever neighbors complained. Even fellow homeless people avoided the quiet man who sometimes woke screaming from night terrors. Walter scraped by collecting bottles and cans, just enough to purchase cough syrup when the winter air settled in his chest. He never begged, never asked strangers for help. His military discipline had ingrained self-reliance that persisted even as his life unraveled. On his hardest nights, Walter would unwrap a photo of Margaret, carefully protected in plastic, and whisper, "Almost there, Maggie, just holding on a little longer." Meanwhile, in his chambers, Judge Carmichael made urgent calls. First, to the VA office, demanding verification of Walter's service history. Then to James Mason, now a colonel, who had once served with both men. "Mason, it's Michael Carmichael. I've found him, the man who dragged me out of Fallujah. He's in my courtroom right now, homeless, arrested for stealing bread." Silence filled the line before Mason replied, "I'm 3 hours away. Don't let him go." The judge quickly wrote a note on official letterhead. Walter Grady is no ordinary homeless man. He represents loyalty forgotten by the country he defended. Though judicial ethics stopped him from dismissing the charge because of personal ties, nothing would prevent him from steering the case toward a different kind of justice. As recess neared its end, the judge's clerk noticed a paper on her desk she hadn't seen before. The famous photograph of Walter with the Afghan child, beneath it a handwritten line. "Some heroes never asked to be remembered." She recognized the script immediately as Colonel Mason's from earlier Veteran Affairs correspondence. The pieces were falling into place. Walter wasn't just another defendant. He was a man whose actions had left marks on countless lives, including those now deciding his fate. When the session resumed, Walter sensed the difference at once. The judge's demeanor had shifted. The cold professionalism replaced by something Walter couldn't define: respect, acknowledgement. Before he could process it, the proceeding veered unexpectedly. In light of new details regarding the defendant's service, this court will postpone all further actions pending a complete review, Judge Carmichael declared. The defendant will remain in custody until tomorrow's hearing. The prosecutor, clearly puzzled, did not contest. Walter, long accustomed to systems deciding his future without explanation, merely nodded. As guards let him out, Judge Carmichael added firmly, "and ensure Mr. Grady receives a proper meal and medical care." That evening, a local news blog posted a skeptical headline. Homeless man claims military hero passed, judge delays ruling on bread thief. The comment section overflowed with cynicism. Another drifter pretending to be a vet. If he really served, why doesn't he get VA benefits instead of stealing? In the county holding facility, Walter faced scorn from a younger inmate who had seen the article on a smuggled phone. "Stolen valor makes me sick," the youth sneered. "Old man," the younger inmate sneered, shoving Walter hard against the wall. "My brother died in Afghanistan, while frauds like you wear the uniform to win pity." Walter didn't strike back. He simply absorbed the hit the same way he had absorbed the indifference of society for years. That night, he refused the food tray, clutching instead his worn dog tags and the photograph of Margaret, asking himself why, after all this time, someone had finally looked at him and truly seen him. Have you ever watched someone judged unfairly based only on how they appear? Share that moment. Someone else may need to hear it. The following morning, Walter was escorted once more into the courtroom, unaware that something unusual was unfolding. Unlike the nearly vacant gallery of the day before, every seat was now occupied. Outside, television crews clustered, barred from entering, but determined to record what came next. Walter's confusion only grew when he realized his overworked public defender had been replaced by a senior attorney with an authoritative presence. The man introduced himself as Richard Harlow of the Veterans Legal Defense Alliance. "Someone has taken an interest in your case, Mr. Grady," Harlow told him, offering no other explanation. As Walter sat at the defense table, the doors opened. Everyone rose as Judge Carmichael entered, but Walter's attention was caught by 3 uniformed officers in full dress who followed the bailiff inside. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Michael Carmichael," the bailiff intoned. The atmosphere was strikingly formal, the judge's tone far different from the day before. "Before we address the charges against Mr. Grady," Judge Carmichael began, "this court will hear testimony concerning the defendant's history, which may bear on today's proceedings." Walter blinked in confusion as Colonel James Mason approached the witness stand. Though older, Mason's posture was still unmistakably military. Sworn in, he spoke with measured clarity. "I am Colonel James Mason, currently assigned to Fort Hamilton. I have known the defendant, Staff Sergeant Walter Grady, since our deployment in Iraq in 2003. Mason turned toward Walter. "This man saved 17 soldiers when our convoy was ambushed near Fallujah. Under withering fire, he drove a blazing fuel truck away from our position, suffering severe burns but preventing an explosion that would have killed us all." A wave of whispers swept through the room as Mason continued. "Later, Staff Sergeant Grady carried a wounded medic, a private first class named Michael Carmichael, nearly 2 miles to safety, despite metal fragments lodged in his own leg." At that, every gaze shifted toward the judge. His composure faltered as he gave a small, unmistakable nod. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. "Your Honor, while this testimony certainly speaks to the defendant's past service, it does not alter the fact that he committed theft." "If I may continue," Mason cut in, producing documents. A review of Mr. Grady's record uncovered a serious administrative error. In 2008, during a system transition, his pension and benefits were improperly canceled. Letters were sent to an outdated address. As a result, he has been entitled for 15 years to $1,370 a month plus full medical coverage for service injuries. That is over $246,000 unpaid. The courtroom fell into stunned quiet. Walter stared at the table, hands tightening around its edge. "Furthermore," Mason added, "we have sworn statements from 5 former unit members, each affirming his service and character. Among them is a letter from General Richards, who credits Staff Sergeant Grady with saving his son's life in the same ambush." Judge Carmichael leaned forward, speaking directly to Walter for the first time. "Mr. Grady, please step to the bench." Walter rose hesitantly. The judge continued, "Ordinarily, I would recuse myself from a matter involving someone with whom I have a personal connection. Yesterday, I did not recognize you. Only after reviewing the record did I realize you were the man who carried me to safety in Iraq." Gasps filled the room. Removing his glasses, the judge's expression softened. "For nearly 20 years, I have sought the soldier who saved my life, knowing only the name Grady shouted amid the chaos. I never imagined we would meet here." Walter's reply when it came was hoarse. "I was only doing my duty, sir." "You did far more than duty," the judge answered firmly. "And this nation has utterly failed its duty to you." Turning to the prosecutor, Carmichael asked, "In light of this testimony, does the state wish to continue?" The young attorney, visibly moved, rose slowly. "Your Honor, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Grady with prejudice." "So ordered," Carmichael declared without hesitation. "Mr. Grady, you are free. On behalf of this court, I offer our deepest apologies for an injustice that extends far beyond today." Walter stood motionless, unable to speak when the back doors opened again. A woman in her 30s entered, her eyes sweeping the room until they found him. She crossed the aisle, tears streaming. "Uncle Walter," she whispered, "I'm Rebecca, Margaret's niece. We've searched for you for years." Walter's frame sagged as emotion finally broke through. Rebecca embraced him tightly, the first touch of compassion he had felt in years that wasn't delivered in handcuffs. Reporters swarmed Colonel Mason. "This is not only about one veteran," he declared, his voice strong. "It is about thousands like Walter Grady, who slipped through cracks in the very system they once protected. Today is the beginning of making this right." By the afternoon, the story had exploded online. News helicopters circled above the courthouse as Walter emerged, freshly shaven and dressed in donated clothes, walking between Colonel Mason and Judge Carmichael. Now formally recused from the case, but present as a private citizen, Mr. Morelli, the shop owner who had filed the complaint, forced his way through the reporters to reach Walter. "I didn't know," he said, visibly shaken. "I thought you were just another troublemaker. I'm ashamed." Walter simply nodded, too overcome to speak. Within 2 days, a veterans group launched a fund for Walter that quickly surpassed $200,000 in donations. Social media filled with similar accounts of veterans lost in bureaucracy, prompting the VA to announce an immediate review of terminated benefits cases. In a quiet hallway away from cameras, Judge Carmichael finally spoke the words he had waited 20 years to say. "You carried me for 2 miles with shrapnel in your leg," he murmured. "The medics told me you refused treatment until I was stable." Walter gave a small shrug. "You were worse off than me." "You said something to me that day," the judge continued, "when I was drifting in and out of consciousness. You said, 'Just keep breathing, kid. Your story isn't over.' Those words kept me alive, kept me fighting. I became a judge because I wanted to keep serving like you did." Walter looked at Carmichael and no longer saw a judge, but the terrified young medic from his memory. "I'm glad something good came of that day," he said. "Not just something good," the judge replied. "Everything good in my life since then. My family, my career, my chance to make a difference. It all exists because you didn't leave me behind." For the first time in years, Walter smiled, an expression reaching his eyes. "No man left behind. That wasn't just a slogan for me." 3 days later, Walter stood inside the judge's chambers in a new suit, his military decorations finally displayed on his chest, the Bronze Star, Purple Heart, and other ribbons telling his story. A representative from Veterans Affairs formally handed him his back benefits and an additional settlement for the bureaucratic error, as cameras documented the event. Speaking publicly for the first time, Walter said, "I don't want pity. I just hope those who follow won't be forgotten like I was." The story evolved from a local human interest feature to a national debate about how America treats its veterans. Lawmakers referenced Walter's case when introducing legislation to reform the benefits system. The photograph of Walter carrying the Afghan child reappeared, now paired with the image of him homeless on Brooklyn's streets, a striking contrast that forced difficult questions about national priorities. Walter Grady, invisible for 15 years, had suddenly become impossible to overlook. What was a moment when you saw justice arrive late, but still worth the wait? Share your story to give someone hope. 6 months later, Walter moved into Veterans Village, a supportive housing community in Brooklyn. His small apartment, the first home he had since Margaret's death, held few belongings, but featured a wall of photographs, Margaret on their wedding day, his old unit in Iraq, and a new picture of him with Judge Carmichael at a veterans recognition event. Walter declined most interviews, but visited local schools to talk about military service and the challenges faced by returning veterans. His calm dignity and straightforward speech resonated especially with troubled teens, who found in him not judgment, but honest accounts of courage and hardship. Each afternoon, Walter sat on a bench at Prospect Park, watching children play, sometimes the same bench where he had once slept when the weather was too harsh for his usual doorways. Outside the Brooklyn courthouse, a new bronze plaque appeared. Justice is remembering those who were once forgotten. Beside it stood a relief sculpture of Walter carrying the wounded medic who would become Judge Carmichael, with the American flag rising behind them. At the dedication, the mayor announced a yearly fund to provide legal aid specifically for homeless veterans called the Grady Initiative. A 10-year-old boy who had often seen Walter gathering bottles wrote an essay for his school paper. "Not everyone in torn clothes is bad. Some people wear memories instead." The piece won a citywide contest and was read aloud at a city council meeting on homelessness policy. Walter maintained a friendship with Judge Carmichael, occasionally joining his family for Sunday dinners. During one such evening, the judge's son asked Walter if he was angry about being homeless so long. Walter paused before answering. "I don't want anyone's pity," he said. "I just hope those who come after will remember those who came before." On Veterans Day, Walter stood before a crowd at Fort Hamilton, wearing his dress uniform for the first time in decades. Asked to speak, he delivered only a few but powerful words. "I once protected this country. Now the country has protected me. Kindness is never too late. It only needs someone patient enough to wait for it." As he stepped down, service members from new recruits to old veterans rose in silent salute. Walter straightened and returned the gesture, his eyes clear and steady, no longer looking down but forward to the future. Justice may be delayed, but it is never absent. Don't give up when you're doing what's right. When have you stood firm while the world stood against you? Share it now. Subscribe to QH Incredible Stories to see that truth and justice ultimately prevail. Share this video with someone who needs faith in doing the right thing. Your Honor, the defendant was caught stealing a loaf of bread from the local market, the prosecutor had once said coldly. The man only bowed his head. "I just needed strength to live one more day." The courtroom had chuckled, but the judge had not. He had just heard the man's name. Who was he? And why had the judge's eyes suddenly filled with tears?